Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us for today's partnership webinar between PiinPoint and Spatial AI. We're hoping this deep dive into the world of geosocial data can be a welcome diversion from the strange new reality that is life for all of us during this pandemic. We trust this webinar is going to inspire you to think a bit deeper about how you might add depth to your site selection and property promotion strategies. The main question this webinar is seeking to answer is this: how can we better understand the unique personalities that define a place and drive business success? Today, I'm excited to be joined by Leiden Faust, who's the CEO and founder of Spatial AI, and my name is Cameron Clapwick, and I'm the Director of Customer Experience here with PiinPoint. Thanks for joining us, Leiden.
Thanks, Cameron.
Before we dive in, I'll just give a quick overview of the various topics that we'll cover in this webinar. We're going to start by looking deep into what's called the data landscape to see exactly where geosocial data fits into the data puzzle. Then we'll dig deeper into what specifically geosocial data is. Where does it come from? How is it aggregated? Who does it represent? And how can we trust it? And lastly, we'll focus on what I think you're most interested in seeing is the specific applications of geosocial data. Whether you're doing site selection, leasing, or marketing, there's a use for it here. We'll wrap up by doing a Q&A session. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick introduction to who we are with PiinPoint and Spatial AI. PiinPoint, we're a group of committed data scientists, software developers, retail trend trackers, geography nerds. We're obsessed with creating solutions that help build and enhance retail communities. We have an easy-to-use location intelligence platform, which provides deep insights into markets across the United States, Canada, and Australia. Over the last number of years, we've worked with hundreds of retailers, brokers, and landlords to help them evaluate site locations, understand their customers, and identify opportunities for growth. Now we'll turn it over to Leiden, who will introduce us to Spatial AI.
Cool. Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, the insight that sparked the company is we realized that there was billions of people talking about their mindsets, interests, and attitudes on social media, and there was no company that was capturing that at a geographic level. So that's what we do. We organize data from Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Flickr, Foursquare into 72 different social segments that can be analyzed across any block group or dissemination area in North America. And ultimately what that looks like is 52 million users, 14.2 billion posts. And what is unique, because there are other social media analysis companies, is this is all linked to geography. So you can see who is in the area and what they're talking about, also what they're doing.
Very cool.
From a company standpoint, we launched this data set in 2018. Now 120 retailers, restaurants are using the data set that represent over 100,000 locations. Really the best way to get an understanding of data is just by opening up and looking at it. So Cameron, would you mind pulling up the taxonomy for us? Okay, cool. So here's our taxonomy. Like we said, we have 72 different segments. So you can see in a community of bookish, which is essentially people talking about literature, dog lovers. So this is self-explanatory. These are people talking about how much they love their dogs, maybe walking their dogs in a community. So we have everything from yoga advocates to lifestyle data to retail and restaurant data as well. But let's jump into one that I think tells a really good story, and that's our Girls Night Out segment, which is Girl Squad. I'll take you through some of the structure of how a segment is built and what it means. So every segment gets a human label, so this is the Girl Squad label. But the way that this is built is we're looking at topics that come out of an area. Remember, this is Facebook posts, Instagram posts, Twitter posts. And what we're doing is we're allowing the machine to correlate mathematically related terms. So, for example, Girls Night Out is the machine grouped the term musicals, ladies' night, dinner with friends, adventures with friends, supportive friends, bar crawls, live music, painting, and sangria together. And there's also a little emoji with two girls hanging out together. So the machine doesn't know why these have some sort of relationship. But we know as humans, this is clearly girls' night out activity going on in a location. So all of these are machine generated and then human labeled. And of course, they're all delivered at a geography, which makes the data powerful in the PiinPoint platform. So you can pop into Phoenix, Arizona, for example, and you can see where girls' night out activity is high, it's really dark, and where girls' night out activity is low, it's a lighter color. So getting into some characteristics of the data, this is purely built on social media, but we do run some demographic correlations to give us a better understanding of who these types of people are. So we can see that these people tend to be relatively younger. Their income tends to be average. The thing that is really unique about this data set, though, is you get time and commerce correlations because the data is so real time. So let's drop down into time, Cameron. So we can see girls' night activity tends to peak in the spring and summer months, and also tends to be more of a Friday, Saturday night type segment. And if you're a property owner or a leasing agent, the retail and commerce correlations will be really impactful and important for you. So, for example, so you can see the bottom, where girls' night out activity is high, the types of retail that tend to do well are cocktail bars, Italian restaurants, sushi restaurants, wine bars, Mexican restaurants. What doesn't do well? Golf courses and auto repair shops. So the indication is if you're a leasing agent and you're looking at a 135 mile radius, girls' night out activity is high. If there's no cocktail bars or wine bars there, that's a great opportunity to capture on an audience that you know is in proximity. And we also have a number of brands that tends to show up when this segment is high as well. And ultimately, the data gets really powerful when you put it in a mapping environment. So Cameron, go ahead and take them through the PiinPoint platform.
Sure, thanks, Leiden. Yeah, we're pretty excited about the integration of geosocial data into PiinPoint. It has its brand, its very own feature panel called Geosocial Segments, and it's super easy to use. So if we drill down into the panel, you'll actually get the option to go through each of the categories that are within the taxonomy, and then drill down deeper into those specific segments that are of interest to you. What's nice here in PiinPoint is that, say, for example, you want to look at the hops and brews segment, you actually get some of the metadata here within PiinPoint without having to jump right over to taxonomy. So you can see example topics that are related, you can see brands that are related, and you can see businesses that are related. So if we're in Toronto, for example, and say we want to look at the bookish segment, say we want to open a bookstore or something else of that nature, we can identify the bookish segment within the library and then turn on a heat map. This is going to show us the areas within Toronto that are indexing higher for this particular behavior. So if we look a little bit deeper here, there's some interesting insights to be gleaned. So around the University of Toronto campus, we see that the bookish behavior trends higher. If you click on a specific dissemination area or block group if you're in the US, you can actually pull up the indexing for all of the segments that you've loaded into the Geosocial Segmentation panel. So here, along with the bookish segment, which we see indexes just about as high as it can get in the entire country, we also see pieces of history, student life, artistic appreciation, and nerd culture, all within the 99th percentile or higher. Scrolling down further, we can reveal some other interesting insights about the area. So at the bottom of the list, for example, we'll see that the area around the University of Toronto campus is actually fairly low in dog lovers. Perhaps there aren't exactly that many hiking trails for dog lovers there. We also see that it may not be the best place to locate your auto repair shop. We have pretty low indexing of the engine enthusiast segment. So you can do this with any segment in any location across North America to drive insights that are relevant to whatever your brand concept is. So now we'll move on to look at what's called the data landscape. So I'll turn it over to Leiden to give us a bit of context about what the data landscape is all about.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, this is just to give you an understanding of like, hey, you've got a lot of data sets that you're using today, and where does this exactly fit in your tool belt? So the traditional data landscape has remained pretty consistent over the past several decades. You have the census data, which is just a treasure trove of demographic information. It contains basic information about populations, but the thing is that the same demographics doesn't always apply the same needs, and that's why we use some behavioral information often when we're making the site selection decision. Psychographic data takes us a step further by releasing a survey. So generally this is coming from the Simmons survey, 25,000 different surveys released every year to get an understanding of, based on your demographics, what type of interests do you typically have? This is great. This is really useful for understanding the demographics of a location at a high level better. But it does miss some pieces. For example, so I'm male, 30, and then Cameron also male, around 30. So we have the same demographic profile. But I was talking to him before the webinar asking, hey, what's your hobbies? So Cameron is really interested in hiking, whereas I'm really interested in things like yoga and green thumb segment, which would just be like gardening. You can't capture that in a survey-based data set because we're really unique as humans. So the thing that's missing is, until now, there's been no organic and self-contributed real-time behavioral data set that is unique to each community, and that is where geosocial fits in. So the problem that creates when you don't have that is you're missing a big piece of the puzzle, a big part of the picture. So this can show up in a couple different symptoms. One, inaccurate models, because you're not capturing who's in proximity to a location. This is if you have a regression model. Investments in declining areas. The census data is generally updated from 5 to 10 years. It can be a little bit lagging. Advertising that just misses the mark because the demographics aren't interested in what they should be interested in. And then tenants that can't pay their rent because they don't fit the community very well. So what Geosocial delivers is it allows businesses to make decisions based on the needs and the desires of the community itself. Additionally, there's a couple aspects that can be really helpful and that are unique about geosocial data that when added to your tool belt, it brings a new picture to communities. So one, it gives you an understanding of your proximity to relevant customers and interests. So if you're Lululemon, you can find out, are people actually talking about yoga in this area, and is this community actually interested in yoga? Another thing is it's independent of demographics. It's another layer of truth that tends to show up really well in regression models. Third, it's up to date. So this data is real time coming in, and we update it every quarter coming out. The data doesn't change that much. Generally is consistent around communities. However, if you're in a gentrifying area, for example, that will be reflected. And then finally, it's story rich. So using this geosocial segments, they have a really powerful story to them, and it makes it really easy to sell internally. I'll give you an actual example of how this plays out. So here are two shopping areas. One is Miles Gray Road and is 183 Perrick Street. So as you can see, demographically, they are nearly the exact same areas. The population is the same, purchasing power is the same, household size is the same. So the question is should you treat these two areas in the same way? And traditionally, the answer has been yes, they're the same demographically. There's no other way to find a difference in the two areas. But let's look at this in geosocial. So a really interesting story shows up about the Miles Gray location when you look at the top 5 geosocial segments. You see that functional fitness is really high, fitness fashion, deal seekers, yoga advocates. The story that this is telling me is this community in particular is really interested in their fitness and in their health. Now let's look at the other location. So we see the top one here is late night leisure, nerd culture, party life, and live and local music. Very, very different picture of a community. So same demographically, but these two communities are interested in very different things. So This actually is a real example that we went through with a fast food retailer that launched a health food concept on their menus and couldn't figure out why in some places it was just thriving. In some places, it totally tanked. Obviously, in the places that people were more interested in fitness, the health food concept worked really well in their menu. So this gives you a picture of how different communities can be, even if demographically they're the same. Just giving you a look at some of our data sources. We've got Facebook, Yelp, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Flickr. Eventful data is in there as well. But mainly when you think about this data set, think about Instagram and Twitter posts, because that makes up the majority of location-based social media. And obviously, we're taking all those 14 billion data points, we're organizing into 72 segments that are super easy to analyze. And what that results in is a map of a community that only a local would know that type of information. An anecdote that I like to use is in our old office location, Cincinnati, right across the street from us was your quintessential revolving door retail location. It turned over 3 different tenants, big retailers, in 5 years. Until 2012, until a mom that knew that that sidewalk was the epicenter for joggers in the Cincinnati neighborhood, opened up a Fleet Feet Sports, which is essentially a sports clothing franchise. And today they are celebrating 8 years in business, and they've expanded to over 3 different locations. So what did this mom know that the analytics companies and these retailers didn't? This mom had an unfair advantage because she understood that community like local. And ultimately what Geosocial does is it quantifies those local micro market insights and delivers them into a mapping system.
So before we jump into specific applications, I just wanted to show you just how fun this data set can be to play around with. For example, if you're in Las Vegas, Nevada, there's some obvious things we could glean about this area just from our inferences, but then there's other things below the surface that may not be as obvious. If you have the geosocial data added in PiinPoint and you turn on the segments that are relevant to you, any of those segments are going to come through in your site reports that you create. So for example, if we created a site report right here in the heart of the Vegas Strip, we'll see not only the top 3 social segments, which will appear in each one of your reports. These ones are actually quite intuitive. So you have wealth signaling. People go to Vegas to show off their bling. You have live experiences. I hear there's a few shows in Vegas, and you have film lovers. But you can also dig into some other things that may not be as obvious. You have quite a number of high indexing segments here, but if we drill down further, you'll see that Vegas actually indexes at 92% for smoke culture, 92% for men's style, and 93% for Asian food and culture. These are not necessarily things that you would intuit immediately about Las Vegas Strip. Or let's take Banff, Alberta, for example. This is a place for people like myself who love hiking. If we dig deep into the social segments here, there's some obvious ones at the top like outdoor adventures and wanderlust, but we also see that the whiskey business segment indexes at 86%. So if you're somebody in the Banff area, you have a bit of capital to spend, maybe a whiskey bar is a logical place to put those funds. We can see some other things interesting here too. Some reason Banff indexes fairly high on pieces of history. Obviously high for natural beauty, wanderlust, and outdoor adventures. You can also see, like I said before, with the Toronto example, things that don't index high, which may be a red flag or a caution if that's the type of business you want to open, but behavior is not necessarily represented in that area. So if I go to the end of the list here, apparently Banff is right in the bottom percentile for hipsters, or at least for the activities and behaviors and conversations associated with them. The same thing goes for activism, dance devotion, all about hair, green thumb, so on and so forth. So you start to dig into some interesting things about areas that you wouldn't have immediately thought. Now we'll jump back to the slide deck here to talk about the applications for geosocial data. As I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at site selection, leasing strategy, and marketing. For site selection, the first question we might have is, how do we actually choose the right segments? How do I make sure that I have the segments that correspond best with my key customer? Well, there's three different approaches that we want to talk about here in terms of making sure you have the right segment selected. The first is using what's called a logical connection. So here, what we do is we intuitively select segments that match up with your core customer, both in simply what the segment is called, the conversations associated, and some of the metadata, the brand correlations, and so on and so forth. This is a good approach to use when you have a good idea of who your core customer is, but you don't have enough performance data to make conclusions about network trends. So if we go into PiinPoint, for example, say we're in downtown Vancouver, BC here, and we're thinking of starting up a yoga studio. Well, if we run through the taxonomy here, we'll be pleased to find that there's a segment called Yoga Advocates. Turn that segment on, and you'll immediately see the neighborhoods in the downtown Vancouver area that are indexing high for that type of behavior. Or say, for example, that you're looking to open an upscale pet grooming salon. Well, you could simply turn to the dog lovers segment, flip that on, and see where that index is high. It's actually quite different than what we saw for Yoga Advocates. You have Nelson Park here, and you have a lot of dog lovers congregating there, so perhaps that's a logical place to open your upscale dog grooming salon. The next segment selection approach I want to look at is called logical segment grouping. So Spatial.ai has actually put together retail and restaurant groupings that correspond with different types of retail and restaurant concepts. So I'm just going to jump over to that and let Leiden share a little bit about the background for these groupings.
Cool. Yeah, so these groupings just get you to the answer really quickly. So for example, let's say you know that you have a high-end customer. We did a correlation with demographics to find which of our segments has the highest correlation with wealthy demographics. LGBTQ culture, wine lovers, yoga advocates, mindfulness, spirituality, and dog lovers have the highest correlation with wealthier demographics. Let's say maybe your retail type is organic and local affinity. We did a correlation of what types of retail do well with our segments, and we found that hipster, handcrafted, yoga advocates, artistic appreciation, mindfulness, and spirituality all have a correlation with organic stores, local stores, and vegan stores. And so you can use these segment groupings for a number of them. I think we have about 20 of them. So if you're a foodie store, you know what to do. If you're an entertainment store, you have a segment grouping for that too. So it just really gets you to an answer fast.
Very cool. Yeah, so what you can then do with that in PiinPoint is actually take those groupings, line them up in your geosocial segmentation panel. So here I have the ones for foodie. We find ourselves in Manhattan, and maybe we're wanting to start a new upscale restaurant or some sort of brunch place. Using any of those groupings, we can then key in on a specific block group or a neighborhood where we want to start our concept, and then get an overview just for those segments. So here we see indexing high for all of our selections. We can then dig a bit deeper, create a report for Cameron's Eastside NYC brunch spot, and we'll see that it's indexing high for trendy eats, LGBTQ culture, handcrafted, ingredient attentive. The very segments that Leiden has explained all correlate well with that specific restaurant affinity. The third segment selection process we can look at is what's called a portfolio analysis. So if you have a network of sites that's decently sized, you can actually identify which segments are appearing consistently around each of your locations. It's a great approach to take if you don't have enough sales data on your stores. It's also an approach you can take to analyze your competitors' locations to see which segments are indexing high or low around their locations. We conducted kind of a sample case study on Freshii. They're not one of our customers, we don't work with them, but what's interesting here is we can actually glean some really interesting insights into Freshii without even necessarily having access to their performance data. We pulled out the top 10 segments for all Freshii locations across the country, and then isolated those that were 95% or higher. What we found are these segments on the right. So you have your LGBTQ culture, you have trendy eats, you have fitness fashion, you have pieces of history, wine lovers, all indexing quite frequently. This starts to help you put together a picture about your brand or a competitor's brand. This is the sort of analysis that can get that much more robust if you actually have information about the volume of visitors to a location. So in PiinPoint, there's actually a tool where you can geofence a site. So you could geofence Freshii's network, or you could geofence a network of hardware stores, and actually make inferences about what locations are doing better than others based on which locations have the highest number of visitors. Isolating those with the highest number of visitors and looking at the segments there, we can actually figure out which segments may be driving success, or at least have some correlation with success. Lastly, next I want to look at leasing strategy. What can we do with the geosocial data to help leasing agents merchandise their center with shopping experiences that are aligning with their customer interests and attitudes? What we can do here with the data is what's called a gap analysis. So we can take every single segment that exists in our library, in the taxonomy, and see for the retail location, the vacancy that we have in mind, or the series of vacancies, what potential tenants might be a good fit based on which segments index highly. So for example, if you were a cannabis concept, you could see in your area, or if you wanted to have a cannabis concept in your space, you could see, does smoke culture index highly in this particular area? If you were looking to have a tenant who wanted to open a wine bar, does that fit well? This just allows you to both enrich the narrative description in your marketing efforts, but also find the right tenants, like not make mistakes on tenants who are only going to last in the space for a few years. You really want to be able to find the ideal tenant mix to help create that thriving retail community. Lastly, you can use the geosocial data for marketing and strategy. So we can actually use the profile of customer interests and attitudes to help customize both the in-store experience, but also some of the operational elements of a location. If you're a franchisee, you could come up with a hyper-localized marketing strategy. Say, for example, you notice that around your restaurant, there are a high number of people who exhibit the cinephile or film lover behavior and the live experience behavior. Well, that'll give you a sense of who you're reaching out to, which can inform your marketing efforts. It could also inform co-branding or co-marketing opportunity with nearby concepts. For landlords and brokers, it can also help you tailor your marketing efforts. As I said before, it helps you create that unique narrative about the segments that index high around your particular location. And if you're a national or a regional real estate director and you're looking at a whole portfolio of sites, you can look for the specific neighborhoods that contain the segments related to your consumers. So again, if you're that cannabis concept, you can look for those neighborhoods that index high for conversations around smoke culture. If we move back to the Freshii example, we can look specifically at how the geosocial data set can potentially inform your operational strategy at a very local level. So this Freshii location, just near Richmond and Church Street in Toronto, Ontario, is indexing really high in both party life and whiskey business. Now, anytime you come across a segment that maybe you hadn't considered, it's always informative to dive into the metadata provided by Spatial, which will reveal things that can inform your operational strategy. So we see, for example, that interest in whiskey is high on the weekends. It is the same case for party life. Interest is high in the late evenings and on the weekends. But if we look at the operational hours for this Freshii location, not only is it only open till 7 p.m., it's actually closed on Sundays. And so there may be benefit from an operational perspective, from a bottom line perspective, to adjust hours to better suit the characteristics of the consumers in the area. So that wraps up our overview of the geosocial data set, how you can apply it, what it looks like in PiinPoint, how you can apply it to leasing strategy, site selection, marketing. We have a little bit of time here, so I'd love to open the floor up to any questions you might have, both about perhaps how the geosocial data set is created and also how it can be applied in PiinPoint. So I'm just going to jump down into the chat here and see if there are any questions. Just a reminder, there is a Q&A function here on the toolbar to enter your questions. Okay, so I see a couple questions here. First question here is, how do you account for particular groups, whether they're demographic or psychographic, that are not active on social media? So Leiden, I'll channel this one your way.
Sure. Yeah, this is a good question. So like I said, this is a tool in your toolbox, but you definitely want to be accounting for people that are not on social media, for example. So don't throw away your demographics. You're using mobile data, don't throw that away. You just want to use this as additional layer. What I will say is that social media has an 81% penetration. So there's absolutely people, especially like older people, over 65, might not be accounted for as much in this. So don't throw your other data sets away. What I think is surprising to people is the amount of older people that are on social media. So actually 15% of our data comes from people over the age of 55. It might be surprising, but think about Facebook. So it's definitely being used quite a bit by the older generation right now, and by my mom way too much during COVID.
Okay, here's an interesting question. This is one for you too, Leiden. Can this data be used to compare socioeconomic neighborhoods? So not only for the benefit of businesses within the area, but also to provide insight into, say, racial disparities, maybe in the areas of income, healthcare, living services, etc.?
Yeah. So that's a cool question. I love that there's a Cincinnati reference here, which is where we're based. Mm-hmm. So that's great. So socioeconomic differences. I'll give you a really quick anecdote of some work that we did with the city of Chicago. So they're working to understand gentrification and how we might do gentrification correctly. I know that sounds bizarre. How do you do gentrification correctly? But there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. The wrong way to do it is where the poverty level just absolutely drops in an area, and then you have dispersion, so people leave the area. The right way to do it, so you're bringing the area up as far as median income, but you are continuing to retain those people. So we're trying to understand how socially can we retain those people, and we looked at a number of different gentrifying areas, and what we found is the areas that were able to retain people, so you didn't have as much population dispersion of the lower income and race. The one difference, or the two differences, is those communities had a high incidence of praise and worship and a high incidence of activism. So communities that organize together and have churches were the communities that gentrified much better. I thought that was an interesting insight, and I think a really cool call to churches. Maybe that answers your question. I don't know.
Yeah, feel free to add follow-up questions too. The next question, this is one for me here, just a PiinPoint application question. So I'll jump back into the platform. Somebody asked, how do you add the geosocial data to a report? Well, the nice thing about the way in which it's integrated into the platform is that if you have a number of segments added to the geosocial segmentation picker, they automatically get entered into your report. So say I have 5 different segments here, or 72 different segments, it doesn't matter how many you have selected, they'll all get indexed in the report. If you're a subscriber to Geosocial Segmentation and you don't turn on any segments, you're still going to see the top 3 highest indexing segments in every report. So what this looks like, of course, are in the reports that we created. So this one for the Las Vegas Strip. This wealth signaling, live experiences, and film lovers that I have here, I wouldn't have had to even turn these on. Regardless of whether I subscribe to the 15 segment or the full 72 segment version in PiinPoint, I'm always going to get the top 3 segments appearing in my report. And then below this, you're going to get each of your selected segments by concentration. So in this example, I do happen to have all 72 selected, but say that you only had 4 or 5 selected, you'd see the concentration and the percentile index for each. Next question is, this is an interesting question. So what is the line of separation between Spatial AI and PiinPoint in terms of expertise and offering? Can they work on their own? So I'll start this, and then maybe you can latch on as well, Leiden, in terms of what Spatial AI is able to offer kind of as a standalone. As Leiden alluded to off the top, geosocial data is one tool in your toolbox. So it is a very complementary data set in that it helps to fill gaps where, say, a demographic analysis can't give you all the answers. Conversely, and maybe Leiden, I'll have you kind of fill in more here. If you were to only have the geosocial data, I imagine that you would also be missing a piece of the picture. So yes, they can be used independently, but you're only going to get part of the narrative.
Yeah, geosocial data is not useful at all if you don't have it on a map. Really, what it is, it's like raw data to CSV. So the best way to use geosocial is use it through the mapping platform like PiinPoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the plug. Next question is a super straightforward one. So how many different segments are available? And maybe I'll add something on to that, Leiden. How did you decide on these segments? So maybe you want to speak a bit to the methodology for dividing up the 72 segments.
Okay, sure, yeah. So there are 72 segments available. Why did we decide on 72 segments? So this is a mathematical calculation. We break it up into vectors. We could have broke it up into 500. In fact, we did at first and realized very quickly that there's no way to keep 500 different segments in your mind. So we brought it down. We brought it down to 100 different segments or vectors to split the data up. Out of those 100, we did a lot of testing and we found 72 to be predictive of retail sales, predictive of demographics. And some of those segments were interesting, but they just weren't really useful from a business point of view. So we removed those segments to simplify it.
Maybe I'll just ask a follow-up question there, because you mentioned the segments potentially being predictive of sales. Do you want to kind of explain how that sort of analysis is done on your end, but could also potentially be done on the consumer end?
Running like a regression model against our data, yeah, sure. So if you have a regression model, if you're hosting your regression model through PiinPoint, that's really where we got started, is predicting sales. So predicting sales for CPG, predicting sales at a product level or at a location level. This data captures who is in that area, what behaviors are in that area. So it's going to add another level of truth and will traditionally decrease error in your model by quite a bit, because it's just new, unique data about what people are doing in the area. So you would use it the same way as you would a demographic variable in a regression model.
Very cool. And maybe lastly, I know you've been doing some interesting work, Leiden, around COVID-19 and the types of conversations that have been happening and the shifts in conversations. Do you want to maybe share a bit about that work and potential applications for that set?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about what we're doing uniquely to track that. And then I'll also talk about how our data is, we're watching it change a little bit. So uniquely what we're doing to track that is we know that now the US just launched a state-by-state reopening, so it's up to the governors. So if you have US-based businesses, you're going to have to be looking at a state-by-state basis, where do we open it up? And so one, you want to look at unemployment. Two, you're going to look at the actual cases. But the third part, which is a lot harder to quantify, are people ready? Are they ready to get out there and eat and shop again? Or are they afraid? So we're looking at a county by county all posts related to COVID. And we're looking at the HOPE index. So counties where people are more positive sentiment than negative sentiment. And that's an indicator of, are people ready to get out there and start shopping again. So it can be useful for closure analysis. It can be useful for where do we open first. And that data, we're making that freely available. So you can grab that data set and you can run with it. You can even run through the PiinPoint platform.
Very cool. I think that's all the questions that I see here. Oh, there's one more here. So the next question is, are there challenges to overlaying close to real-time geosocial data along with older census data? It's an interesting question there.
Yeah, I guess, from an analyst point of view, so the way that our data set is designed, it captures a 24-month running window. Okay, so the reason that we do that is because let's say that you had an event at your location, like a brewery event. Whiskey business may have went up, or hops and brews may have went up in that neighborhood in that month. So we want to know consistently, what has that area been like for the past 2 years? And absolutely, the last month's data is going to be captured in there. So that solves for that. Now, you're going to find a little bit of differences, like you saw in the gentrifying area. It might look like that area is not particularly good for business, when in fact, it's a very lively area where there's a lot of people doing the things that are relevant, or is capturing people that are your relevant customers in proximity to you. The data sets are going to be a little bit different. And I think really that's valuable. And as an analyst, you always got to look at what's going on and tell the right story.
And Leiden, how do I know that, say, one individual person or one business in an area isn't disproportionately like driving up the index of a particular segment?
Yeah, good question. We filter out all businesses from this, so it's just users. And the second thing is a user can only contribute one time in a given block group. The rest of their posts are then taken out, because we want an even distribution. Because there's some people that are a little trigger happy on social media. We all know those people. We block them on Facebook.
Somebody's asked, are we a subscription-based service? And the answer, I think, on both counts is yes. So if you have any more questions, feel free to get in touch with me after the webinar. Just one more question that I personally had that I haven't had the chance to ask you, Leiden, is just around the volume of conversations happening in an area. So when I look and I see that something's indexing high, what does that mean to me in terms of actual people? Like, what should I consider that to mean in terms of actual people having conversations about a particular topic?
Sure. So the way that our data is designed, it's scored from 0 to 100, and that's a ranking. So if you are at the 100th percentile, you are the #1 blog group or dissemination area in your country for whatever that is. Be it dog lovers. I think we saw a really high one for student life at the university. Anything above the 50th percentile means it's higher than normal. Anything below 50th percentile means it's lower than the average block group. Does that explain your question?
Yeah, like for example, if something was ranking in the 100th percentile, say around the University of Toronto, that's probably representing like hundreds and hundreds of posts.
Oh, yeah. So we also have an index at the end of our data set that gives you an understanding of how many posts made it up. So yeah, you can check out how many actual posts are happening there with that index.
Oh, very cool. Okay.
I did see a question that I want to make sure that we answer, and is I don't know I have it up, but it's essentially like, is this, can we look at this in related to demand
Ah,
in the area? So let's say, for example, that hops and brews is really high in an area. No, let's say fitness is really high in an area, and you're trying to place a gym, just to make it really simple. So it might be that fitness is really high in the area, and there's already a lot of gyms that are capturing on that type of consumer. That's where you would want to look at the geosocial score, and then you would want to look at relative to what are the POIs already in that area. Obviously, if the community is interested in fitness and there are a ton of gyms there, maybe you should reconsider or look at an accessory POI to fitness, which is vegan restaurants and tanning is some of the retail concepts that do well with that.
very cool. I think that wraps up all the questions I see here. Any other thoughts? Any other things you think maybe are worth mentioning that we haven't shared yet, Leiden?
You know, if you guys have questions, feel free to send it over to the PiinPoint team, and I can be helpful as well.
And I'll just leave this last slide up here too. Feel free to reach out to either of us too if you want to dig a bit deeper into any of the stuff that we talked about. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today, taking this time out of your noon hour to learn a bit more about the geosocial data set. We're excited to field further questions and see you dive in PiinPoint and apply this to your unique workflows. Thank you, everybody, and thank you,
Thanks.
Leiden.